Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, dear students, wherever you are listening and whichever time zone you are in. My name is Moses Rubalema once again to take you through the comparative education and to continue with the factors that affect our education system in the country. Previously, we had discussed about the political and religious factors, and now we continue with the next factor, that is the geographical factor, and we want to see how the geographical factor affects our education system in Uganda as follow. So when we're talking about the geographical factor of our country and how it plays a major role in setting up the education system, we should also note that both the geography or the geographical factor and the economy or economic factor tend to work hand in hand, or they are always at play. For instance, the first factor, how it influences, the first effect is that the geographical factor determines the type of economy of the country basing on the availability of resources. Hence, it has a direct bearing on the financial investment in education. Therefore, the more the resources a country has, the more the funding, and the less the resources the country has, the less the funding. And that's how the geographical factor plays a big role in line with the economy in influencing our education system in Uganda. So the geographical factor also determines the nature of infrastructure or the structures of schools that are to be set up in the education institutions. In terms of buildings, for instance, in Uganda, there are many open classes that allow fresh air. Unlike in temperate countries, in Uganda you find that most education institutions, the classrooms, the windows are relatively at a lower level, such that there is free air flushing out through the class as the teaching and learning is taking place. Unlike in other areas, in the temperate areas where the windows are relatively high, so that people are not affected so much by coldness and so on. The geography also determines the means of transport to school that can be by road, by air, by water, or railway. And in most cases here in Uganda, our means of transport is by railway, implying that the geography plays a very big part in determining the education system of our country. The geography also determines the school ongoing age limit. For instance, for the case of Uganda, even children at the age of 3 can start going to schools, especially these kindergartens and so on. But in areas like Denmark, children can go to school after clocking the age of 7, because the weather conditions there are that harsh to very young kids, and therefore it influences the education system in that, as far as other countries or regions can access education at a younger age, even at the age of below 4, but in some areas the geography determines the age to reach the school. As we have seen in Denmark, where the harsh climatic conditions or weather conditions are not favorable, and therefore children have to reach school at the age of 7 and above. The geography also in Uganda determines the kind of curriculum And this also affects the timetable arrangements depending on the time zones and the weather conditions. Take an example in Kabale. Kabale being relatively hilly, steep, and so on, and even it being affected by cold weather, and the climatic conditions there are quite wet or cold, so the classes cannot take place at the same time with those areas where the weather is relatively warm, like in Kasese, Fort Portal, Kampala, central areas, and eastern. So for the case of Kabale, reaching at school at 8 is normal, whereas in areas of central, east, and some parts of Rwenzori region, children even reach at school as early as 7 a.m. and classes can even start before 7 a.m. or at exactly 7, and by 8 a student is late to be at school. That leads us to another factor, that is the major one, which is the political factor. Here, the type of politics has a bearing on the type of education in the country. For example, if the country is democratic, then the education given to students is likely to create most democratic students, and the education given will also create democratically inclined citizens of the country. But if the country is dictatorial in nature, as we have had in some countries where dictators are managing the economies, then the citizens produced, in this case the students, for such education system are bound to be dictators by nature. Therefore, in democratic countries, peace is normally emphasized, and the output of the system are normally peace-loving people, patriotic, and therefore the politics of the country influences the education system in various ways, as we are going to see. One, the education policies are all determined politically. For instance, it is the politicians in parliament who debate on policies of education. For example, the national policy on higher education had to be passed by the politicians. The curriculum cannot come or cannot be enforced without the approval of the politicians and the parliament at large. So politics plays a very big role in determining our education system. And what we have to keep in mind is that any education system focuses on the national goals. That implies the political part has to play a major role in enforcing and monitoring the education system of the country. And when it comes to budget allocations, they are all decided upon by the politicians. They decide on how much to be allocated to education sector. They decide on how much teachers should get as their salaries, and all of that is under the political will of the country. And if it is that positive towards education, therefore the education system is likely to progress very well. Then the reforms and innovations in education are also debated and decided upon by the politicians. Take an example, the government white paper of April 1992. That is quite many years. The minimum standard indicators for schools that were brought up by Fajil Mande then, all were being determined by the politicians, and so the political will is very important in as far as education system is concerned. Then the curriculum sometimes is determined by the politicians, and indeed they have to have a very big role. Their input is very important. For example, the teaching of political education, muchaka was one time compulsory in the education system in Uganda, but later on the political education was phased out, and the political wing had to give its reasons as why the political education had to be waived out. Then the politics also influenced the management of institutions, education institutions. For example, the teachers and the head of institutions or education institutions get support from the local politicians, or else they face problems in the management of education institutions. Therefore, the politics still play a major role in determining the headship of educational institutions in Uganda. Then the politicians also pass regulations and educational acts within the government that govern the operations of education institutions. Take an example. The regulation or abolition of corporal punishment came as a result of the political directive or political debates to ensure that the learners are not inflicted bodily pain such that they can study very well, or create a conducive environment for the learners. And the political will was very positive on the abolishment of corporal punishment, and should institutions continue implementing such, they have to be penalized for breaking such rules of managing education institutions. Then the political, the political will also helps in the regulation of education acts that govern the operations of the education institutions. For instance, the regulation on corporal punishment, I think that one is repeated. Then if there is a political instability, it affects the education system in a sense that it brings about high school dropout and even people running away for their lives, and therefore the political instabilities or the political climate in the country affects our education system in so other ways, like it can influence it positively and negatively. Then political instability also may also bring about the brain drain, in that some people who are trained in there can tend to run away for their dear lives. This is because the highly qualified manpower, especially the workforce or the teachers, may move to areas of the country which are peaceful, or to outside the country which are peaceful areas, and some are forced even to leave the country, hence affecting our education system. Next is that politics also interfere with the school programs. For example, mono-teaching, normal teaching, timetables or teaching load, extracurricular, and all those. For instance, if a politician comes in a school, he or she has to be given time to address the education institution in that particular time, and that affects our education system. Colleagues and my dear students, we are going to continue to discuss more of the factors that are affecting the education system in our country, and lastly we shall look at At the So colleagues and my dear students, we have at least discussed 4 of the factors that affect our education system, but that does not limit us on finding out more of the factors. Take an example, the ethnical factor and the other factors that are in play in as far as determining our education system in Uganda is concerned. Thank you very much, and we shall connect in another subsequent lectures. Thank you.